Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for news across the state of Washington. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is a production of the Center Square. You can go check out all of our stories at thecentersquare.com. Today on Washington in Focus, updates on a hate crime bill in the state of Washington, updates on a firearm possession ban in certain locations, and a bill that critics are claiming is undoing parental rights. All that and more coming up on this edition of Washington in Focus. We'll be right back after this.
They're simple, boring, never thought of until they're needed. They're windshield wipers. Only when Mary Anderson became annoyed that New York trolley drivers were stopping to wipe their windshield by hand did anybody do something about it. By attaching a spring-loaded arm to a rubber blade, one woman made travel easier and safer. Look to innovate and pass it on. From passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus, a production of the Center Square. Now, let's get into the headlines. With updates on a hate crime bill coming out of the Washington Legislature, here is Eliana Kernodle and the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell.
A Washington House committee voted to advance a bill that would broaden the definition of a hate crime in the state. TJ Martinell with the Center Square is here with more. TJ, how would this bill change existing state laws around hate crimes?
So under existing state law, a hate crime is when someone commits an act of violence or destruction of property or damage to property based on a perception of a person's identity. So that law was changed because originally it said victim, but now they just say a person's perceived identity. And they have a long list of different identities that are protected under our state's hate crime law. This bill would change that by making it a hate crime if someone did so in part or the whole based on the perception of the identity. So currently, for it to be a hate crime, the only motive for a person doing the act is based on the person's identity. But if they had other motivating factors, so if somebody broke into somebody's house and was for the purpose of stealing stuff and ended up committing an act of violence against a person based on their perceived identity during the burglary or robbery or whatever it is, that would not be prosecuted as a hate crime because it wasn't based entirely on that. So this is what this bill is trying to change.
There were some comments made by a committee member that have raised questions about just how widely this legislation would apply. Can you get into those comments?
Yeah, so there are concerns of certain lawmakers who vote against the bill is that it's broad in the sense that it's based on perception, and it's not based on the perception of the person who is being prosecuted. It's based on the perception of the alleged victim, on a person who's not even a victim of the crime, and based on the perception of the prosecutors who decide whether or not to take it to court. So somebody could theoretically have be prosecuted and convicted of committing a hate crime who they didn't consider it a hate crime. But the problem is they're prosecuting them based on a motive, but the only person who knows that motive is the person committing the act. And so unless it's like clearly provable in some way, shape, or form. And what's interesting about our state law as it's currently written is that prosecutors are allowed and directed to infer that a person committed a crime based on the person's perceived identity unless proven otherwise. That was something that was raised during one of the committee meetings, the public hearing for the bill by one lawmaker, and she actually had it read into the record because people were disputing whether or not that's what the state law as it is currently written says. And the other issue that was raised is what they consider to be a selective enforcement. So certain things are considered hate crime. But one example by Representative Dan Griffey, he kept asking people who were testifying in favor of the bill, if someone trespassed on his property and burned the American flag he has displayed outside his house, would it be considered a hate crime? And the responses he got for the most part were, I don't know. And there was even the King County prosecutor who prosecutes hate crimes. He asked her the same question and she said, I don't know. It would depend. So for someone like Representative Griffey, it seems like that should be considered a hate crime, but it's not, because it's not included among the identities that are protected by this law.
And there was a specific example that one of the legislators in favor of this bill gave of something she thought should be a hate crime.
Yeah.
What was that?
So according to her, she said that she was on a bus or some sort of form of public transit, and there was a woman wearing that head covering. I'm not sure what the proper word is for it, but an individual also on that same public transit was berating her for it. And according to the lawmaker, was kicking and screaming and saying that their religion was different from hers. And to her, she thinks that she reported it to the police allegedly, and allegedly the police said we can't do anything about it because for various reasons. But she thinks that should be something that you could go to jail for. The issue with this, and it was actually raised by one of the lawmakers, is they were kicking and screaming, but they weren't physically attacking the person. They weren't threatening to attack the person. They didn't damage any property. They didn't physically attack this woman. They simply they used profanity and they were vulgar in what they said. But as one lawmaker pointed out, that if anything, that's verbal harassment, but calling that a hate crime is an issue because the person's not committing any violence. So under our state hate crime law, a hate crime is when you physically attack someone or cause damage to or destruction of property. Neither one of those occurred in this case. So this is where it's getting into instances where mere speech could be potentially subject to prosecution.
So where is this bill at in the process now?
So it passed out of the House Community Safety Committee last week, and it's been referred to the Rules Committee, and that is the final committee before it goes on to the House floor for a vote. So it's being fast tracked through the legislative process. So it could potentially be up for a vote very soon.
A big thanks to Eliana and TJ for that coverage. You're listening to Washington in Focus, a production of the Center Square. The hate crime bill is not the only piece of legislation raising some eyebrows this week in the state of Washington. A Senate committee also voted on a bill last week that would restrict the possession of firearms in thousands of locations across the state of Washington, although some in the legislature have been able to push back and get some exemptions on that. With more, here is Eliana Kernodle and the Center Square's Tim Klauser.
A Washington Senate committee voted on a bill last week to ban the possession of a firearm at more than 5,300 places, but Republicans managed to add an exemption for people with a concealed pistols license. Tim Klauser with the Center Square is here with more. Tim, what will this bill do if it's passed?
Yeah, so this bill, Senate Bill 5098, proposed by Representative Valdez out of Seattle, it would essentially take the next step in efforts that the Democrat majority has been pushing for the last few years in terms of gun control. Last year, Valdez had another bill very similar to 5098, except last year was 5444, which essentially did the same things, but in terms of limiting the open carry for accredited zoos, aquariums, and other areas. So Senate Bill 5098 essentially just adds to that list of areas where it would be illegal to possess a firearm. Now, I have the list here of where it's currently illegal. Currently, it's illegal to possess a firearm with certain exemptions. So some of these areas do have the CPL exemption. Restricted areas of jail and law enforcement facilities, courtrooms and other adjacent areas, public health facilities, taverns and cannabis dispensaries, airports, libraries, the zoos and aquariums, like I said, and transit facilities. So Senate Bill 5098 would take the next step by adding city and county parks, public buildings, county fairgrounds, and playgrounds where children are likely to be present. Now it's up, if this passes, it would be up to the municipalities. So say each county and city to designate which parks, public buildings, and et cetera would apply. And they would be responsible for posting the appropriate signage showing that it's against the rules to carry there. But yeah, that's essentially what this bill would do.
And this isn't the first time that Republicans who are in the minority have worked across the aisle to get an exemption like this in similar legislation. When did the exemption apply with previous legislation, and what would it apply to this time around?
Yeah, that list that I mentioned earlier, that has kind of built up over time. I'm not exactly sure which out of all those that the CPL exemption applies to, but I know it for sure applies to the public libraries, accredited zoos and aquariums, certain transit facilities, certain areas of those transit facilities, not all of the facilities. So they've worked across the aisle. Last year, when Valdez proposed his Senate Bill 5444, which covered the zoos, aquariums, and et cetera, that bill didn't include the CPL exemption. And it wasn't clear. The bill amended an existing law, which already had the CPL exemption, but it wasn't until GOP legislators asked committee staff last year, hey, will this CPL exemption apply to these new areas where it would be illegal to possess a firearm? And the committee staff said no, despite what the prior legislation had done to protect CPL holders, this bill would not afford that same protection. Now, Senate Bill 5098, when it was proposed, it didn't include that CPL exemption either. It was sort of a similar case. The existing legislation, which it was amending, made it look like it would provide the CPL exemption, but it wasn't until GOP lawmakers and the NRA asked during the public hearing about the inclusion of the exemption, and they clarified that no, it would not include the exemption. Now, about 2,000 people signed in just for this bill for that public hearing. About 500 in support and 1,500 against. So a few days later, when the bill came back up for an executive session, the Republicans were easily able to add that exemption due to that just overwhelming opposition.
With these sorts of things, it's easy to focus on kind of the back and forth of the policy question, but there's also the question of the cost. Like how much will this cost the state to enforce if the law goes into effect?
Yeah, well, I have some numbers right here that I can share. So the fiscal note that's tied to the bill or the proposed bill at this point says it could cost upwards of $6.87 million. Now, that would cover posting signage at every applicable park, building, et cetera, that they know of. 2 signs, I think each costs about $640. Somewhere around there. But that would cover 3,327 city parks, 1,405 city buildings, 345 county parks, 195 county buildings, and 39 fairgrounds. Now, those numbers aren't completely solid. That could change depending on what they deem is where children are likely to be present. But it's still unclear who would be responsible for that cost. Now, state law already requires the state to provide these resources if they're raising the cost of living. But some of the testifiers weren't so sure about that during the public hearing, and they asked about that and reminded the legislators. And it was brought up again during the executive session a few days later when Senator Fortunato asked, look, is this another unfunded mandate? Because if the state doesn't pick up that $6.87 million, which might not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things, all of Washington cities and counties are going to pick up that cost, which is going to be more burdensome for them. Not to mention the overarching revenue shortfall that Washington State is looking at over the next few years, upwards of $10 to $16 billion.
And what was some of the other kind of back and forth as they were debating this bill? What were the arguments being made?
Yeah, some of the banter was pretty predictable when it comes to gun control legislation. There was mentions of how, restricting access in all these areas would essentially create shooting galleries in these gun-free zones where mass shootings might occur. Similar back and forth to what you hear on a lot of bills. During the public hearing, we had testifiers that talked about their experience with gun violence, how they were victims themselves, situations where they were in parks with their children and there was an individual open carrying that made them uncomfortable, but there was nothing that law enforcement could do about it. There was a lot of back and forth. But there was also a woman who mentioned a recent incident that I believe occurred sometime over the summer in Point Defiance Park in Tacoma, where a woman was attacked violently and needed over 180 stitches. Now, the Tacoma Police Department, after this, said that people need to take precautions when going around Point Defiance. And the testifier in this case said that, being able to carry these firearms are how women protect themselves. Now, taking away that ability would limit their ability to protect themselves.
And where is this legislation at in the process now? What's the next step?
Yeah, so I have that pulled up as well. So it was proposed in the Senate, sent to the Senate Law and Justice Committee, who had that public hearing that I mentioned, then an executive session where they added that CPL exemption. Now, the majority of the committee motioned to pass the bill. So not that it's passed entirely, but it's moved out of the Senate Law and Justice Committee and into the Senate Ways and Means Committee, where further adjustments might be made before it's scheduled for a floor debate and then sent to the House. So it's still got a long ways to go, but it does have some momentum behind it already. And I think the majority is confident that it will make it through this year.
A big thanks to Eliana and Tim for covering that story. You're listening to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus this week has been very, very heavy focused on bills coming out of Olympia, and we're going to stick over there with our Capitol correspondent, Carlene Johnson. She's covering a bill this week that critics are saying is undermining parental rights. Here is, again, Eliana Kernodle back with Carlene Johnson this time to go over something that is raising eyebrows around education, parents, and more.
This week in the Washington Legislature, a bill intended to undo many of the parental rights guaranteed by last year's Initiative 2081 got a hearing. Supporters of the measure argue it's critical to ensure the safety and education of students struggling with gender identity and other issues, while parents who supported the measure last year argue their rights should be paramount. Joining me is the Center Square's Washington reporter, Carlene Johnson. Carlene, House Bill 1296 comes in response to an initiative to the legislature passed in 2024. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that was Initiative 2081, and that was one of 6 initiatives to the legislature delivered by that group, Let's Go Washington. There was parental rights, capital gains, the restoration of police pursuits, income taxes. That's just a few of the many that were set. And Initiative 2081 was one of the ones that lawmakers in 2024 ended up adopting, because that's how it works. If it goes to an initiative from the people, goes to the legislature. If they choose to ignore it, it goes directly to voters in November. If they adopt it or choose to take it up, they can choose to, vote it up or down. So they did approve it. And what it did was give parents access to information about their children's education and their health. Gave parents rights to access a sex ed curriculum. Gave them access to medical records. Say I've got a child that is potentially confused about gender identity, or maybe divulge some information about a sexual experience to a counselor. I, as a parent, then would have the right to have access to that information. So that's what 2081 did. And now comes House Bill 1296 to basically undo every single piece of what 2081 did. And Eliana, during a Thursday morning hearing of the House Education Committee in Olympia, which was pretty packed for an 8 a.m. meeting on a Thursday in Olympia, the sponsor, Representative Monica Stonier, took some really direct questions from Republican members of the House Education Committee, including Representative Matt Marshall, who said, okay, are all these rights that are being repealed the same rights that were just passed by the legislature last year after an initiative by the people. And the response was yes, the bill removes the rights that were established in the legislation and enacted by the legislature 1 year ago. So clearly this comes in, response almost word for word to Initiative 2081 passed just 1 year ago.
And as you mentioned, there was a hearing that was held Thursday morning, and there were a lot of people who were there, but I understand the vast majority of people who signed in to testify did not get the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. So this is crazy. So I've been to a ton of these hearings over the years, right? But I got a couple of emails from either side on this legislation earlier in the week, both from folks saying, come and show up or sign in pro, come or show up, sign in con. I got both of those as a member of the media. But in being there in person Thursday morning, there were far more people in attendance hoping to testify that were opposed to HB 1296. But what's interesting about how these hearings work, it's up to the committee chair completely how the hearing goes, right? So you've got 2 hours set aside. It went from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Thursday morning, but there were 3 bills being heard. And even if you've got a bazillion people there that want to testify about one particular bill, it's up to the committee chair whether that gets first on the agenda or last on the agenda and given very little time. And that's what happened on Thursday morning. And there were many people there that were very unhappy about the fact that the committee chair, Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos, only allotted 25 minutes at the very end of the hearing for this bill that 1,400 plus people had signed in opposition to. To be fair, there were close to 1,100 people that had signed in, not wishing to testify, but signing in support of the measure. But all that to say, there was very little time given for public testimony.
And as you mentioned, there were other bills being discussed in this same hearing. One of them is having to do with declining enrollment in Washington schools and studying that. How might that be related?
Well, that was fascinating because the other 2 bills being discussed, one was from Representative Skylar Rood on financial literacy, basically making it so by the time your kid graduates high school, he knows how to balance a checkbook and understands what, interest rates are. So that's moving forward. And he's a Republican, and that took a great deal of time. The other bill being discussed had to do with declining enrollment. Washington State public school districts, 295 of them, have lost over 4,600 students in the last few years. Huge chunk of change, right? Because the state gets money based on per pupil in each district. And so they have this bill to study why people are leaving, basically an exit interview. They want to study it because they don't want to lose more students.
As always, a big thanks to all of our reporters this week on covering the news that needs to be covered across the state of Washington. This has been Washington in Focus, and I've been your host, Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is a production of the Center Square. To keep up with all those stories you heard about today and more, go to thecentersquare.com or go check out our Center Square YouTube page where we have extensive Washington coverage. Until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.